My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
by sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
Hello there. I feel like I should learn how to say that in Mandarin for this episode, but nonetheless, welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
I mean, I give you enough. I have a hard time for your accent in other languages that I do speak. I feel like people might give you a hard time for your accent in a language you clearly do not. Who knows?
It's true. I do not know Mandarin, but
maybe enough people who listen to the podcast also don't know it, so they might not, take offense to it or anything.
Yes, even Asian John did not speak Mandarin, so we are definitely lacking in that department. But what we aren't lacking in this week is Beef Pork Ribs, who is back after the birth of his child. Do you have an official podcast name for this baby?
No. We still haven't, because I thought of a couple, but I have not passed them through Mjolnir yet. And given how she felt about, was it meat tenderizer? I don't know. I will have to get her through that.
Well, we mentioned it while you weren't here, but once again, congratulations to you and Mjolnir. You're full-on parents now, so I'm sure our listeners would love to know what the first couple of weeks of parenthood have been like.
Not a lot. Actually, I was going to say not a lot of sleeping. That's not strictly accurate. I just wake up significantly earlier. But also, it has been very unusual for a number of other family reasons that have nothing to do with the baby. And so I've ended up driving a very significant amount of time since the baby has been born, which is unusual, but there was family to drive around and family obligations to attend. And so it's been very tiring, but I think that this week should be a little bit more of a getting into a routine, which I'm very much looking forward to, with no visitors, just the three of us.
And Mjolnir and unnamed baby are doing well?
Yes. Other than the last 24 hours, baby has been feeding almost every hour, which is unfortunate, but at least she's still been sleeping pretty well. So we're taking that as a win. Hooray.
Well, I'm happy to have you back. I've of course enjoyed the company of everyone who's been a part of the show, but I did miss you.
From the little bits of the podcast I managed to listen to, and knowing the greatness of this community, I'm sure you were fine.
So we do have some Dooms delays that have come out since our last time talking about delays in movie releases. Venom: Let There Be Carnage had a release date in September, but it's now coming out on October 15th.
So I've been in the periphery listening to a lot of Mjolnir's podcasts, including baseless speculations and a lot of things talking about like the Spider-Man movie and how, it's Sony's last chance to try to maybe mess up the MCU in some ways and like throw their own, the properties they still own into the movie somehow. And so I don't know. I am excited for Let There Be Carnage, but in its own merit as a, hopefully another kind of a swing and a miss, but I don't know. It's this weird thing where I actually feel like even if it does have nothing to do with the Spider-Man universe or the Morbius movie,
yeah,
I I don't really care. I think it'll be hopefully just a good time.
I was admittedly worried when the most recent trailer came out because instead of actually mentioning a release date, it just said this fall, and I was like, oh no, what does that mean? Like they weren't even willing to commit to a date anymore because they were, worried about release dates shifting.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at the list you've given me for the Doomsday, and there's only one that I have, well, two that I have something to say about, other than, oh yay, they're delaying again.
Well, I certainly hope. I mean, I think this is actually better for Venom because the first one kind of benefited from coming out in October, and it was like a kind of because it was like a monster movie in a sense. It kind of benefit from that Halloween timing. So I think this will actually benefit this new
Hmm.
Venom to come out right before Halloween. So it's
Yeah,
probably
especially
good.
if Woody Harrelson is going to give the performance that it looks like he will be able to give.
Yeah. But Top Gun Maverick, it was supposed to come out in November, and it's now been delayed till next May.
They're
Remind
really, really keen on making this a summer blockbuster, eh?
Well, I remember when we talked about movies coming out in 2021, and then we were commenting on how that movie had been delayed almost 2 years at that point. So it's really going to be old by the time it comes out. I really question their decision to push it even farther away.
Well, at least it's mostly in the military, so there shouldn't be too much product placement that goes out of date.
Right, that's a good point. But Ghostbusters Afterlife had its release date shifted 1 week from November 11th to November 19th. So it's not
Presumably just because of other movies shifting around.
probably.
So I feel like if
watched
it
the
only shifts a
trailer.
week, it's just they're altering it to make room for something else. But when it's like, another half a year, that's they're trying to do something.
Yeah. I'm actually excited for that. When I saw the trailer, and it seems like this will be an actual spiritual sequel to the original, like it takes place in the same universe as the original movies.
A
As
kind of
opposed
Bill and
to,
Ted situation.
yes, unlike the 2016 Ghostbusters, which was basically like a remake in modern day.
And Bill and Ted, I think, is still in the top 5 movies that came out this year, easily. So,
Well, that came out last year. If you're,
oh
that
yeah,
was
that's true.
2020.
Technically,
We're
it
in
did. You're
2021.
right.
I know for a lot of people, these years just sort of feel like it's just one long year because of the pandemic. But we're like 2/3 of the way through 2021 already, and I feel like a lot of people still feel like it's 2020.
Yeah, that's true. But I will see. It'll
Dune
become easier for me to count time because I'll be counting birthdays.
Dune was supposed to come out October 1st. It's now coming out October 22nd.
That's not too bad. But it's kind of, I don't know. Again, with the same thing as Carnage, are they trying to start marketing it as something like spookier? Because it shouldn't really fit that, but at the same time, it could be marketed that way. I don't know. Like, there are, wars, aliens, mind control ish kind of things.
I mean, I saw a trailer for it today before seeing Shang Chi, and it looked pretty epic. Like it didn't feel like it was being marketed as like a scary movie. It was kind of like
Well, that's
presenting itself
good.
as this big epic. A lot of stuff going on I did not understand.
Probably, yeah. I mean, that's kind of the problem with that franchise is that it is very complex stories but also kind of very of its time, which is interesting. But like I don't fear for this movie not being epic. I still don't know how it'll be a good adaptation. Maybe it won't be. Maybe it'll just be a good movie set in the universe or with the same themes, which I'm open to. Like I've matured since the days where I completely hated Jackie Chan's Around the World in 80 Day because this is a terrible adaptation of the book. But I rewatched it and I'm like, oh yeah, no, this is a good movie. So I'm hoping Dune is at least that.
And finally, we have well, actually, the Clifford the Big Red Dog movie was just removed from the release schedule, so who knows what'll happen to that. I was really looking forward to it.
It would have been a good follow up to Paw Patrol.
Yeah. Actually, you might not have heard this, but I really enjoyed the Paw Patrol movie, so I don't want to even put in the same anywhere near this Clifford movie, which whenever it does come out, looks
Maybe they will be. I don't know.
like
It's
but we have No Time to Die. This James Bond movie that was supposed to come out in April 2020 is now set to come out October 8th. And I don't know if we've talked about it or if you've heard this elsewhere, but apparently they've marketed this movie so many times and the budget is so big that in order for the movie to break even, it would have to gross like $900 million.
yeah. I mean, I've heard it. I don't know if we talked about it specifically, but like, there's no way this movie's making $1 billion.
No.
Especially if you look at what has been happening to new movies at the box office, and like, it almost feels like they've managed to kill the James Bond franchise. I don't think permanently.
That's hard. That's harsh.
Well, I don't think permanently, but like, you know, they kind of tend to like, maybe sometimes they'll have a bit of a like a turnover or a period between the Bonds or between a Bond and a like one of the Bonds that only lasted for one movie, and then they'll be pretty consistent with doing, you know, once a year for a decade or so. But it feels like they're going to need like a break or a really bad Bond to kind of renew the franchise. Because I don't know, like, especially if you look at this movie kind of in the general way that Daniel Craig's movies have gone. You know, it started pretty good, and then they had the most forgettable James Bond movie ever made, and then it was decent, and then, you know, Skyfall happened, and everybody's like, oh my gosh, this is good, and then Spectre was a huge disappointment. I mean, it wasn't terrible, but it was a disappointment, and so it's this weird kind of up and down, and if this movie is great, that's good, but it would have to be really amazing to make that money and even to just renew the interest in the franchise, I think. And I don't think it's up to it.
Well, we'll find out in a month.
That's true.
But today we are talking about Shang Chi, and specifically his new movie, Shang Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And as always,
or in my case, exclusively, because I have no idea about him in the comics. Oh, sorry, that's a spoiler for my SOS.
No, go ahead. Your secret origin. You don't know who he is.
I mean, it's pretty straightforward. The thing I was most excited upon hearing this movie is hearing that Jackie Chan's stunt team was going to be in it.
Well, I don't know much more than you do, to be honest. I think how I first heard about Shang-Chi is I remember reading an article about the founding of Marvel Studios, and Shang-Chi was included in the list of characters that Marvel still had the rights to. And it was like it was considered back in 2005 as like what were the bottom of the barrel characters. So like Captain America, Iron Man, Power Pack, Cloak and Dagger, Black Panther, and Shang-Chi, I think, were like the only characters that that the movie rights hadn't been sold to someone else at that point.
I mean, one of those has done well so far, and well, by the sounds of it, Shang-Chi is doing pretty well too, so.
Yeah, to the point where I thought he was called Shang-Chi. I've been calling him Shang-Chi all these years, and it was just this year, as they were marketing this movie, they're like, oh, no, it's Shang-Chi.
Ah, okay.
And I'm like, oh, I don't know Chinese names very well.
Oh, okay, yeah, because if it was Shang-Chi, it'd be spelled with an X.
Ah, okay, I'm glad you understand a little bit better than I do.
I've played enough Dynasty Warrior games to have just a little bit more of an understanding, even though those are Japanized versions of Chinese names, which I've become aware of recently.
So I literally did some research on the comic book character Shang-Chi today to get a sense of who he was before I went and saw the movie. And I learned that Shang-Chi made his first appearance in Special Marvel Edition number 15
Ooh.
in 1973. Apparently, there were some guys at Marvel Comics that wanted to do an adaptation of the Kung Fu TV series.
Oh, okay. The one where they cast an African American because putting an Asian man on TV was unthinkable at the time?
Yes, but because that show was produced by Warner Brothers and Warner Brothers owned DC Comics, they wouldn't allow Marvel Comics to have the rights to the Kung Fu series. And I don't know why this was the case, but there was this real interest in Kung Fu stuff, martial arts in the 1970s in America. So
Really? it would have nothing to do with Bruce Lee.
Was that? I don't know. Is that when Bruce Lee made his like debut here?
I mean, it was in the 60s into the 70s,
Right,
but a
because
lot of his
Green Hornet
movies
was
came over from China more in the 70s because he had started making a name for himself in the 60s.
right because he was in the Green Hornet.
Yes.
How could I forget? Mild side tangent. I've been watching MASH and I've noticed some anachronisms related to comic books. For one thing, they reference Kato and I'm like, this show is supposed to be set in the 50s. That show didn't happen until the 60s. And there's a scene where Radar is reading a comic book, but it's an issue of the Avengers. And I'm like, the Avengers didn't exist in the 50s when the Korean War is supposed to be happening. Someone should have been like the continuity director on set pointing that out.
Maybe they just forgot that it was happening during the Korean War and just assumed that it was happening during the Vietnam War because clearly it's what it's protesting.
Yes, yeah. Or maybe Radar is a time traveler and he's actually
Ooh.
from the 60s and he's there. I'll go with that. That sounds like a better fan theory.
Yeah, I like it.
But back to Shang-Chi, I guess because this martial arts craze was going through the US, he became an instant hit. And 2 issues after his appearance, he actually like took over this Marvel special series and it was like renamed Shang-Chi, Master of Kung Fu or something. And it was published for like 10 years.
Wow, that's more than I thought it would be.
Yeah, it went on to like 1982 or something. And, you know, we've talked about some characters like Black Widow who never really were able to maintain their own solo series for very long because they just didn't have the sustained popularity. And Shang-Chi had it. He had what was going on for 10 years or so. But after...
But I guess there wasn't much representation for the martial arts genre, probably.
Not
I'm
really.
assuming that's kind of where it comes
Yeah,
from.
it was basically that and Iron Fist.
Yeah.
So nonetheless, once his series ended, he kind of disappeared. And it's only been the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years that he's like made pop-up appearances here and there in Marvel Comics again. And just now in 2021, they've started a new ongoing series about Shang-Chi. So can't imagine why they'd want to launch a new comic about him now. Total mystery. So he's, let's just say he's a pretty obscure Marvel character. And I think that's actually, I'm going to get into it, but I think that's what benefits this movie is that he is so
The way that the
unknown.
Guardians were. And it also benefited that movie.
Yes. So Shang-Chi, I don't mean to pick on the guy, and if anyone is a fan of the Shang-Chi character from the comics, good for you, but he is quite literally like a bottom of the barrel character. Like he is one of the few characters that Marvel couldn't sell the movie rights to. And in fact, apparently I'm reading his history, it says there was a brief period where DreamWorks Pictures had the rights to a Shang-Chi movie, but they couldn't get anything going and the rights reverted back to Marvel.
Interesting.
So, needless to say, he was basically like a no one, no one knew who he was unless you read those specific kung fu stories from the 70s. And when they finally announced they were making a Shang-Chi movie at Comic-Con 2019, they made a point of telling us that the title was going to reference the 10 Rings. And as soon as I saw that title, I thought to myself, brilliant way to get fans of the MCU interested in this movie about a character we've never heard of before. By tying in the 10 Rings organization, which was, of course, first referenced in the very beginning of the MCU in Iron Man 1. And infamously, both the 10 Rings and the Mandarin were parts of Iron Man 3. And there's many parts of this film which are very clearly meant to be an apology for Iron Man 3. And it is glorious.
I mean, I don't think Iron Man 3 needs that much of an apology. I do understand why people were upset about the Ten Rings kind of and the Mandarin specifically, but I mean,
he's supposed to be Iron Man's biggest villain, and he's a non-presence essentially.
Yeah, but okay, first they were trying to build him up to be a big deal as much as they could in one movie, and the MCU hadn't fully gotten into the swing of doing multi-movie storylines. Also, Ben Kingsley was a great Mandarin. Like, both as the Mandarin and as the actor. Like he worked really well.
See me coming.
I hope I didn't spoil Iron Man 3 for any of our listeners who haven't
Listen, Iron Man 3 came
watched
out
it
almost
yet.
10 years ago now, which is weird to think about, but
Time is a weird thing. I discovered recently that the Mega Man Battle Network series is 20 years old, and it made me feel really old.
so this one has had some delays, but not necessarily too many. Like it's still like it was originally set to come out in February 2021. So it has, yeah, it's only been, I don't know how many months is that, like 8 months, 9 months it was delayed. But it would have been interesting to see how it would have done with the original release, because I think putting the release in February, they were trying to replicate what Black Panther did by like coming out in February. And then I think it was supposed to come out during the Chinese New Year as well, which probably would have like, drawn some attention to it in the same way that they released Black Panther they marketed Black Panther during the NBA playoffs. Didn't come out during the finals. Anyway, people thought that this movie was getting like the raw deal because it was getting released on Labor Day weekend here in September. And apparently movies don't do well Labor Day weekend. It's like, for whatever reason, it's like no one wants to go to the movies on Labor Day weekend. So there were genuinely some people who felt, oh, they're really screwing Shang-Chi over by shoving it into the September release date. They don't want to shift Eternals. They didn't want to shift Eternals any farther ahead. So they had to keep Eternals where it was. And they're kind of stuck with Sony for Spider-Man. And so as they were pushing Black Widow farther up, they had no choice but to also fit Shang-Chi in somewhere. And now we have this weird thing where it hasn't even been 2 months since the last MCU movie come out, and there's already another one.
Yeah, but I think it also... I lost my train of thought there. Yeah, I may. Yes, relative to other things that have come out with Marvel, I think it also is in a kind of a good spot, because it is like it's kind of a layover between all the big. I mean, What If is still happening, but Loki just finished, and the Eternals is probably gonna set up something bigger. Most people are assuming the Eternals is going to set up something bigger and something more universe breaking, possibly the next big villain, unless that happens in What If. But it was a good time to introduce a new character for the next phase, but without kind of making it a huge deal. Also, apparently there's tie-ins with the Spider-Man movie, or should be.
This
But
movie
I think
also
we'll get to that in the spoilerverse, maybe.
So I don't know if you saw this on social media, but Disney had like a stakeholder meeting a few months ago where they announced that both Free Guy and Shang-Chi would get a theaters only release. And they referred to this as an experiment. They said, we're going to experiment with these two movies doing theaters only and not doing like a simultaneous Disney Plus release. And Simu Liu, who plays Shang-Chi, like replied to it on Twitter saying, like, we are not an experiment. Like, and he seemed to be implying that they were suggesting that because the film was like, had a majority Asian cast, that it was okay to like experiment, or that they were like some kind of like science experiment or something for them to put out to the world, or and it's like we can risk this movie not doing well because it's not as important as other movies we're making.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily what they meant, but it does kind of feel. It's a weird thing where they're like stuck between the justifying that, well, it's a mostly Asian cast movie, and well, it's a B, C, D tier hero movie, so it's not like I can understand both sides of it, but also it feels like they probably should have maybe chosen their words more carefully. But it's Disney; they don't tend to do that.
So in the end, speculation abound. Shang-Chi did bring in $71.4 million this weekend in North America, which means it has the second highest opening weekend of the pandemic beyond Black Widow. And people are speculating that because this is theaters only, that it'll do better overall in theaters than Black Widow did because, you know, you don't have as much rewatch factor when you can also stream it.
Right. But the when we're talking about when the stats for Black Widow were theaters only.
There were, yes, but then what they're observing these days with most movies that they're dropping a lot their second week. They might
Yeah,
open
yeah.
big. So they're saying because Shang-Chi is only in theaters, it's more likely that the numbers will stay high or
Yeah.
they
Well,
won't
I
drop
mean,
as
I'm
fast.
probably going to go watch it this weekend, baby allowing. Um, so who knows?
Yeah, so it's broken the box office record for Labor Day weekend. The previous record holder was 2007's Halloween, which made $30 million its opening weekend.
Oh, wow. That's more than double that. So that's
Yeah.
pretty impressive. Although I feel like there is a certain point of like, are people gonna like? I feel like the Labor Day thing is that mostly it's a family holiday where you get together with a lot of people and do things, and getting together, doing things, not been the theme of the pandemic.
Yeah. So anyway, the movie's doing well. It interestingly has like one of the highest audience rankings on Rotten Tomatoes ever.
Interesting.
uh,
Nothing could
yeah.
possibly be inflating that.
Yes, probably. But who's to say? Now, it was your plan to see the film, but due to family things, you have not seen it. So
Correct.
you're gonna get lots of spoilers here.
Oh, I'm fine with spoilers as if you think that the movie is actually worth watching, which I think has been the general consensus at this point.
I will attempt to do the Blu-ray case description for Shang Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings.
Those who came before us made us who we are today. Everything you need is already inside of you.
There's no going back. It's time to show the world who I really am.
Hell yeah.
Marvel Studios Shang-Chi, rated PG-13.
2 weeks ago, you were parking cars, and you're now saving the world.
Yeah. In theaters this Friday.
Remember how everyone was upset about how the Mandarin was handled in Iron Man 3? Well, here's a movie that retcons all of that and gives us a much better representation of the character, while at the same time telling the story of a guy named Sean who is trying to run from his past and is confronted with the legacy of both his parents and kind of has to embrace his destiny. Lots of fun stuff happens, some cool fight scenes, and probably I would say the movie I've enjoyed the most since the pandemic has started.
I like it. You know what it makes me think of, kind of? I was going to say Mortal Kombat, but that's not the one I was thinking of. It seemed to have some like thematic similarities with the Snake Eyes movie.
I have not seen that yet, so
Well, I haven't either, but in the idea that it's bringing this big crime syndicate based in Asia that doesn't really have to do with the main storyline, but we're trying to make it important, and because there's one character who's probably going to become more and more important, I'm guessing. Well, I mean, Snake Eyes has always been important for G.I. Joe for reasons, because he's cool, and G.I. Joe just lives by the rule of cool, lives and dies by it, and so I feel like it might be handled a little bit better with the MCU, but still, it feels a little bit like that. Like it's a setup.
I gotta say, just hearing the MCU opening, like the Marvel Studios opening, like logo thing in the theaters again, it made me chill a little bit, because obviously we're inundated with it because you hear it at the start of every MCU show that's on Disney Plus, but just, I don't know, just seeing it and hearing the music in the theater again, for the first time since Far From Home came out in July 2019.
Oh, wow.
Because I never end up seeing Black Widow in the theaters. I only watched it on Disney Plus.
I can't remember. No, it wasn't. Never mind. Because I saw not New Mutants. What was the?
Yeah, that was not MCU.
Yeah, that wasn't MCU.
That was one of the last. That was like the last Disney Fox, or not Disney Fox, Marvel Fox.
Yeah.
anyway, it was just really like nice to hear that and to see it on the big screen again. And so I was like, yes, I'm back. I am here. And it seems like movie theaters are going to stay open because they're putting limitations on who can attend movie theaters in Ontario. So in
Oh
theory,
yeah, you guys are getting that.
yes. So in theory, there should be no reason why they shut down again. So I'm game. I'm ready to go.
I like it. Yeah, we don't quite have that yet. We have we're not actually sure what's happening in Alberta. So, but I am looking forward to watching movies in theaters again, but it does require a child to be able to be quiet for more than an hour, which
Yes.
we'll see if that happens.
So I think why I like this movie so much is because my expectations were so low. Like I literally
That's not a nice thing to say.
Well, it's because I know nothing of this character or like
Right.
What got me excited about the movie was how they were going to tie in the real Mandarin. Because they made that short film, All Hail the King. I don't know if you ever saw that. It was like it shows you Ben Kingsley's character in prison
Oh, okay.
after the events of Iron Man 3, and then it ends very ominously with people from the real Ten Rings coming up and saying like, "Oh, like our boss would like to talk to you."
I see.
So that short film got everyone excited because it's like, oh, there is a real Mandarin out there who isn't pleased with how he was used essentially for the plot of Iron Man 3. Almost as if it's like this off-screen Mandarin is like the Marvel fandom talking to the movie. So the fact that they referenced the fact that the Ten Rings were going to be part of the Shang Chi movie and that the Mandarin was going to be in it, that admittedly was what got me excited about seeing this. Not Shang Chi himself, because I had no experience
idea
with
who he
Shang
was.
Chi. Yeah, and I think
Well, it's a similar thing. Like I said, the thing that got me excited about this movie was knowing that Jackie Chan's crew was in it.
Yeah.
Not the characters or anything else that happened. I'm like, this should be a good martial arts action movie. I haven't seen one of those in a while.
Yeah, I would go as far as say this barely qualifies as a comic book movie. And what I mean by that is that the comic books about Shang-Chi, he has an origin, he has a backstory, and he has whatever. But this movie completely reimagines almost all of it. And like the version of the Mandarin you see here is a completely reimagined version. And even like what the Ten Rings are, it's completely reimagined for what it was in the comics. And I feel like I've had this conversation about other adaptations where if you're going to change everything but the name, like why even call it that? But I feel like in this case, it's because the source material isn't that strong. And I think this is what Marvel Studios it does at its best, is where it takes some very obscure characters and obscure stories, and they turn it into a movie that people can enjoy. Like that's certainly how I see Guardians of the Galaxy. That's how I see this movie. I'd probably throw like Ant-Man or Doctor Strange into that as well.
Yeah. I think especially Ant-Man.
But
especially because they didn't go for Hank Pym as Ant-Man, especially.
No. So in the pure sense, you can't even really call this a comic book movie because it takes comic book characters and it says, what can we do to make these characters interesting and relevant in the 21st century? Because like, in the comic
Which is not what was happening in the 80s in comics.
No, like in the comics, Shang-Chi's father is this character called Fu Manchu. Who like Marvel had the rights to at that point in the 70s, but then they lost the rights to him. He apparently was like in some novels. And even the fact that there was an Iron Man villain who was Asian in origin and they literally gave him the name the Mandarin just goes to show you how they weren't really thinking about how to represent these kinds of characters in comics. So in a sense, I think it's a good thing that they completely said like, yeah, we're not going to tell those stories. We're going to.
Well, yeah, especially the Fu Manchu is a horror book.
Yeah,
classified as such.
Yeah. And it feels new. Like I think that's also what I appreciate about it. Like Black Widow just sort of felt like another Captain America movie, just obviously with her that kind of movie. But this feels new.
Yeah.
The focus on martial arts and the martial arts mixed with the comedy, like people online have compared it to like you talk about Jackie Chan's crew. It's like there's one fight scene that's full of like slapstick
yeah
action.
Well, that was That was also something that I remember Mjolnir talking about a few times. I don't know if she did on the podcast, but like the best MCU movies when they're like not just superhero movies, they're like Civil War was a superhero thriller movie, right? And was it Civil War? Yeah, Civil War. No, Winter Soldier. Winter Soldier was a superhero slash thriller, right? And you get like when you get movies that are superhero movies, but that's not what defines them principally. That's when the MCU mostly is at its best because DC still is trying to figure that out a little bit. Although you could argue that the Joker movie was kind of that. It was a comic book movie, but not really because it only had enough elements to market it as such.
In the preview, like all the the pre-show stuff for the movie, there's an interview with Simu Liu, and he tells a story about when he was a struggling actor, like getting started, that he would like dress up as superheroes for kids' birthday parties. And he like says in this interview, "Oh, I played Spider-Man a lot because I couldn't show my face because there aren't really any Asian superheroes, or there weren't any." And that was kind of sad to hear. It's like he was only allowed to play characters where you couldn't see any of their skin because he's Asian. And there are Asian characters in mainstream superhero comics, and you could argue the whole manga industry is full of Asian superheroes. But I think his story there just speaks to a reality that, in terms of like living in Canada, where he is from, there in the mainstream there aren't many Asian superheroes. So it was
And
admittedly
a lot
kind
of them were villains because of a lot of things,
yeah.
including World War II.
But it was kind of heartwarming, I guess. Like it's like, yeah, you've come full circle now. Like you can go to a kid's birthday party dressed as a character that you're playing in the movie, and like we have an Asian superhero, a Chinese superhero in a movie now, which I don't want to downplay that. Obviously, I as a Caucasian man, I can't like I think it's cool, and I enjoy the movie and his character, but certainly that representation, it doesn't connect to me personally because I'm not an Asian man.
Yeah. No, I can understand that. But it's also, I think it also is a nice thing overall for specifically something like Marvel that is starting to be worldwide and that has implications on saving the planet. Because, like, I just, since the quarantine ish, Mjolnir and I have been watching Supernatural a lot, and it's like, oh yes, there's all these world-ending cataclysms that are all happening in the U.S., mostly in the Midwest, and it's like, yeah, what are the odds of that actually happening? Like, they pay lip service to other things, but there's a lot of shows have this, and a lot of concepts have that, and I feel like even the comics kind of had that problem. It was like things were either happening in the U.S. or in the imaginary countries in Europe that the villains live in.
I was struck by the amount of I think it's Mandarin they're speaking and not Cantonese. I can't tell the difference, but there's a lot of like I think for the first like 5 or 10 minutes of the movie, it's mostly spoken in Mandarin with subtitles. And there's
kind of like what Mortal Kombat did.
Kind of like that, but I'd commented when we reviewed.
Except that was Japanese.
Yes, that would have been Japanese. Well, there was Japanese and Chinese in one.
Oh yeah, that's true. There was. Sorry.
But I commented when we reviewed the Suicide Squad how I was impressed with the amount of times there were people who would be speaking non-English languages talking in non-English to each other. And the stereotype you see in a lot of movies that they're just talking English even when it doesn't make sense for them to be speaking English for the sake of us, the American audiences. In this movie, there's a lot of Chinese being spoken. And I think there's only like a couple scenes that come to mind where both people in the conversation have Chinese as their native language, but they're choosing to speak in English. And they kind of get around that being like, oh, like you need to practice your English. So it's like conveniently creates a scenario for both characters be speaking English for the sake of, again, the Western audience. But I thought in terms of trying to make this an authentic Asian story with Chinese characters, to have them speaking that much Chinese, it made it feel a little more legitimate.
Yeah, and I mean I think it's something that we're getting better at, and I say we, like Hollywood is getting better at, because I remember growing up watching a fair amount of French films, like from France, because I'm French, and it's something that Europe does a lot. Partially though, because you also have a lot of like film studios or organization or actors guilds that actually aren't rich enough to do a full movie, so you will get a lot of more collaborations between different countries, and in which case they want to have the different people speaking different languages. So like I remember watching a movie that had no subtitles, which they spoke French, English, and Italian in. I didn't understand the Italian part, but it was the most minor one, but it's still it was a kind of a nice thing, like. And I feel like I don't know, rewarding for people who do speak the language. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with Bon Cop, Bad Cop, but
I've heard of it.
I really enjoyed that movie because, I mean, it was, it's a Canadian movie and they speak French and English, whenever relevant to the plot. They speak French when they're in Quebec, they speak English when they're in Ontario, and, between themselves, one of the two, depending on really where the power dynamics is between some of the characters. And I think that that's also something that's interesting. And I think that was also something that was cool with the Mortal Kombat movie, because the Lin Kuei did speak Chinese, and then the Hattori clan spoke I can't remember, spoke Japanese, but like, and there was a little bit of a like, oh yeah, you don't understand me, so I'll stoop down to your language, and fun subtext you can do with those kind of things. I feel like from what your description, Shang-Chi didn't do that as much, because they kind of had the practice your English, which I mean,
well, they also got around it because Aquafina's character in the movie, she's like born in America and only speaks English. So there's a lot of like scenes she's in. It's like, okay, well, I'll speak English so that the American can understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, it's not like the that joke in Dragon Ball Z Abridged where the Namek starts speaking the universal language, English.
Yes. So, while I really enjoyed the movie, it definitely has the trappings of a lot of MCU origin movies. Meaning that you end up fighting a bad guy who has like a very similar power set to you. You're embracing your identity. There's a very the big finale has a lot of CGI going on, and you kind of get lost in everything that's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a perfect
formula.
Well, yeah, but it works, and if you're able to also just get enough personality out of it as well, I think that makes it work pretty well. Because even Guardians Volume 2 had kind of that, weirdly enough, because it was the second movie. But there's so much personality and good other scenes that went into it that it kind of makes you forget that, at the end, it's just Quail and Ego fighting with exactly the same powers. There's just a few other things happening as well.
Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of comparisons you can make to Black Panther, because you have a lead character who is surrounded by strong female characters. It's all about family and family dynamics. And of course, the similar narrative about representation and giving part of the audience a chance to see a superhero like themselves on the screen. It's kind of interesting if you had this like spectrum of like wanting to embrace your destiny or your role in your family. You'd have Thor on one side, who was like, yes, like, I want this, I want it, but the story says I can't have it yet. And then you have Shang-Chi on the other end of the spectrum, who's like, the story's telling me I need to do this thing, but I don't want to do it, so I'm going to run away from it. And then you have like T'Challa in the middle, who kind of like, see, the story tells him you need to do this, and he's like, okay, I'll do it, but I'm very apprehensive about this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it also, I don't know, this doesn't really have to do with Shang-Chi, but like you mentioned that, I immediately thought of the What If episode, where like it was very like it was very situational that T'Challa was the Black Panther and was fully in with Wakanda, and like, but it didn't change who he was as a person, whether he took the path of Black Panther or not. I think that was something that, yeah, definitely would be different with like Thor, or to a certain degree with Shang-Chi. From what you say, is that if they hadn't been placed in their family settings, they probably they wouldn't be the same person.
There's a scene in the movie where Shang-Chi is having a conversation with his sister. And I had this almost like out of body experience where I kind of looked at myself in the theater and I said, I can't believe it. I'm in a movie theater watching a movie about a Chinese superhero that I'd never heard of before this movie was announced. And it was just this moment where I was like, we've gotten to this point where there are so many superhero movies that they're literally like, there's any character that's ever been in a comic book has the potential to be in a movie. And it's not just the fact that they actually made the movie. I'm like, I'm really enjoying this movie about this character I'd never heard of before. Like, and it was just, how far have we come from that time when like no one wanted to make any movie about any superhero, and now every superhero kind of gets their chance to shine.
Yeah, that's true, but it also has kind of the downside that you really have to I guess it's not a downside, because it seems like this movie has done it pretty well and other movies too, but like you have to kind of create something new and something original and something that works outside of just the superhero context, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is a much better opening to Phase 4 than Black Widow was, because whereas Black Widow kind of felt more like an epilogue to the Phase 3 stuff, this introduces a lot of new elements. You see stuff you haven't seen before. There's a focus on martial arts that outside of the Iron Fist show, there hasn't been anywhere really in Marvel content. And it opens up a lot of doors to where they can go from here. And it is a little long. Like I certainly feel like I was like, oh wow, like I thought the finale finished. I'm like, no, okay, there's still more movie. All right, buckle up. So this is a longer one. It's over 2 hours, and it is admittedly a movie where you can feel the time. Unfortunately, like it feels like it goes for a while. But that's my biggest complaint with the movie, is that it feels like it goes too long. But I really want to talk about some spoilers, so we're gonna go inside the spoilerverse. Right. There will be a time code in the description to get around these spoilers. So, beef pork ribs. I'm sorry that you won't get to hear about this when you see the movie, but to my surprise, Ben Kingsley's character has a fairly significant role in this movie.
Oh, that made it interesting. He was hidden from the trailers.
Yeah, he's not in any of the marketing. It wasn't until I guess he showed up for like the press junket that they're like, oh, I guess Ben Kingsley's in the movie.
Yeah, interesting. I like that though.
So the apology they do for Iron Man 3, there's two scenes where they really hit on it. There's like one scene where, and this is the interesting thing too. Like they market Shang-Chi's father, everything up to the movie, as the Mandarin, and like, oh yeah, like he's the real Mandarin. He's the leader of the 10 Rings. He's the guy that was upset that Aldrich Killian was using his name in Iron Man 3. But interestingly, he never actually calls himself the Mandarin. He says, oh, that's the name. Like they didn't know what my name was. They knew what the 10 Rings are, but they didn't know the name of the person in charge. So they just sort of came up with the Mandarin. He's like, they named me after a chicken dish. Like he kind of calls out how ridiculous it is to name a villain after, the Mandarin. And so while he's like spiritually, I guess you could say, the same character as the Mandarin from the comics, who's like, the leader of this organization, has these aspirations of taking over the world, he never calls himself that, and he's never quite as Dr. Doomish as the comic book Mandarin is.
Right. And he doesn't fight Iron Man.
He never, there's never, like, there's one mention Iron Man when Trevor, they find Trevor Slattery, Ben Kingsley's character, in a prison at the Mandarin's compound. Sorry, he's not the Mandarin. His name is Wenwu. That's his like given name. they find him and he explains, oh yeah, like, you know, Iron Man blew up the terrorist that was using using the name of the 10 rings, and then I was in prison, and then I was captured and brought here. So they kind of like gloss over the plot of Iron Man 3 very briefly. And then they have the scene, where Wenwu kind of like talks about, oh, like, you know, an American terrorist used the name of the 10 rings to scare America. And it was, admittedly, you could see that they're like retroactively trying to make up for misrepresenting the Mandarin in Iron Man 3. But it was like, apology. Well, I appreciated it, even though I'm not a fan of Iron Man enough to care about the Mandarin. But also, Trevor becomes a comic relief character in the movie. He discloses that he got clean of all his drug and alcohol problems in prison. So now he's just like this thespian British actor. And he ends up accompanying them, and he ends up being there for the final fight and everything. And he's like, he becomes a source of comic relief, and he was a welcome addition to the movie. I was very surprised he was in it, and I was very happy that he was there. Now,
Yeah, I mean, Ben Kingsley's always great, and I think it works well, but I think it's good because it keeps, you know, continuity even with something that itself did not keep, because Iron Man 3 is in this weird place where like they kind of ignore everything that happened in it in the MCU. A little bit like Iron Man 2 and 3 kind of have that problem where they're like this weird kind of transition where like they'll take few elements but like leave most of what was in the movie behind when Iron Man returns in other movies. And so it's nice that at least something came out of it.
It's kind of, and this is where I say it's like it's kind of a comic movie, but it isn't. But they basically take this idea of like, here's this Iron Man villain who has these 10 alien rings that give him all these superpowers called the Mandarin, and they've reimagined him as this guy who finds these 10 rings that are not like, they don't give him different superpowers that fit on his fingers. They actually like go on his like forearms, and they like fly around, and it's I guess they're taking the idea and they're making something different with it. Like in the comic book, Shang Chi and the Mandarin have no connection at all, but they've obviously invented one here, swapping out the Fu Manchu character for Wenwu,
which I think, you know, which is a better. But I think it also like it's. You know, I don't think, like you said, it's not a problem that they change a lot of these things. I think it's, you know, it has generally mostly been for the best that they change or added things. So I'm going to keep trusting that it's going to remain that way.
It's going to be hard to like sit and understand this movie. I think the world building MCU is getting very complicated because on one hand, they try to establish that the 10 Rings is another organization that's been around for thousands of years. So I'm like, okay, so you got the Eternals who apparently been on Earth for thousands of years. You got this has been around for thousands of years. You got Hydra that's been around for a long time. You got this Black Widow organization that's been around for a long time. You've got the Wakandans who've been there for a long time. You've got Doctor Strange and the Sorcerer Supreme, that whole thing that's been there forever. And then you got the TVA that's been there the whole,
yeah.
So it's like to draw out a map of like, here are all these organizations that it's starting to feel like an actual comic book universe where it's just hard.
Which is kind of a good thing. And Wong shows up at some point too, right?
Yes, Wong has some good appearances in the movie. But then also
that was a tie-in with Spider-Man we were talking about.
Yeah, his appearances, I know that in the Spider-Man trailer it looks like he's like going to like some kind of temple place, but his appearances here seem to be completely unrelated. You see him once, he's in like a fighting tournament situation where he and the Abomination are like kind of like play fighting with each other. And then you see him at the end where he like comes and gets Shang Chi and Aquafina, be like, "You're coming with me. We gotta like we have to talk." But also there's like this village that that Shang-Chi's mother is from, that's like lives in like a different dimension, but it's like within Earth somehow. And I guess if you're just watching this movie and you're just accepting this movie as it is, you're like, okay, sure, I guess this makes sense. But then if you're trying to make sense, how does this fit in with everything else? Your brain does start to hurt. It is very clearly like meant to be set in present day. Like there are references to the blip and people kind of having to move on with their lives post blip and whatnot. But in that sense, it's pretty self-contained. Like it doesn't have too many clear connections to the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But admittedly, the world building and the number of organizations that have been around for a long time, it's starting to get a little ridiculous.
Yeah, and but it also is a good way to start putting them together. And I feel like the opening of the multiverse, I know they're not going to try to do that, but it is a possibility to just retroactively put some movies or some things that happen in a different universe. And we might even get that. Edward Norton might show up as Bruce Banner in another movie,
Oh my.
which I'm not against that. I think it'd be great.
When you see the movie, you'll have to tell me how you feel about this, because in the movie, Shang-Chi has this companion named Katie, who's played by Aquafina. And it's established that they've been friends for like 10 years. And, early on in the movie, someone's like, oh, like, when are you guys going to get married? And like, oh, no, we're just friends. And then his secret comes out that, he's lied to her all these years, that he's actually the son of this, criminal, and that he has all these kung fu martial arts abilities. And she gets over that pretty quick, and then she ends up getting like tagging along for the whole adventure and gets involved in the fighting and stuff. And then towards the end of the movie, after all the fighting's done, they never kiss, but they're like sitting there, like kind of like with leaning their heads on each other, and they seem to be like a package, and they never really, the movie at least never defines their relationship, and you can't get the sense like are they romantically involved, or are they just like close friends? You'll have to tell me what your feeling of it is when you see it, because it certainly confused me.
Okay. I will do that for sure.
And by the end of the movie, Wenwu has passed away. Like there's no longer a leader of this Ten Rings organization, and Shang-Chi comes into possession of the actual like Ten Rings himself. So going forward from here, Shang-Chi is going to be the one who has the power of the Ten Rings, not Wenwu. And like I said, the 10 rings are not what they were in the comics, which like they were like 10 alien rings that they were basically like 10 different Green Lantern rings that were like alien technology, but because they were so advanced, they seemed like magic, which is why they were always a good like conflict for Iron Man to overcome, because it was technology he couldn't understand.
Yeah, sorry, it just kind of, every time you talk about the 10 rings, I just keep thinking of Sonic. It makes me laugh a little bit.
Well, admittedly,
sure, and also alien rings.
They're flying around in this movie does feel like Sonic, so there's a good comparison there. One of the post-credit scenes, it's Wong, Shang-Chi, and Katie talking to holograms of Bruce Banner and Captain Marvel. And they're like trying to analyze the 10 rings, and they're like, it seems like nobody knows what these things are made of or where they come from. Captain Marvel's like, they're not anything I recognize from space, and Wong is like, there's nothing in our books about these rings, and Bruce Banner is like, I don't know what these things are either. So they're so that was really cool, because it's showing us like the reality of like, yeah, they're bringing these characters from this movie into the larger MCU. There's a big mystery now about like what these actual objects are and where they come from, and they mention that the rings are calling out to something, which people are thinking is going to lead us to Fing Fang Foom, if you know who that is.
He appears in the trailer, doesn't he?
So that's a different dragon.
Oh, okay.
But not Fing Fang Foom.
I see. They look eerily similar.
And interestingly, like, it's Mark Ruffalo. Like, he's not Smart Hulk anymore. So I don't know if they're going to explain in the She-Hulk show that he isn't Hulk all the time anymore. But it was regular old Mark Ruffalo, but he still had his right arm in a sling, like at the end of Endgame. So maybe he's decided to revert back to Bruce Banner once in a while for the sake of the budget. I don't know. But that was admittedly cool. there's a second post-credit scene that establishes that Shang-Chi's sister, who has a major role in the movie, has now taken over the Ten Rings organization, and it's unclear if her intentions are good or not. Because when we meet her in the movie as an adult, she's running this like Fight Club organization herself, and she's kind of, I would say, Sharon Carter power broker kind of levels of ambiguity in terms of is she good or is she bad. So
I don't know. I feel like by the end of the show, Power Broker was pretty bad.
right, okay, fine. Shang-Chi's sister is a little less. She's not clearly as bad as Sharon is, but we're still left with the cliffhanger of like the 10 rings will return. So we're not sure how that organization is going to influence the rest of the MCU. We certainly know that Shang-Chi is going to be involved in something, but I left the movie being very excited.
Well, that's a good thing, because I don't know, the last couple of Marvel things haven't really done that for me.
While we're still safe inside the spoilerverse, are there any spoiler-specific questions you'd want to ask about the movie?
Okay, how good are the action scenes? Like, one, how good are the action scenes? Two, were they generally filmed in wide angles?
So sadly,
It's a very specific question. Sorry.
Remind me what it means when something's shot in a wide angle.
It means that you can it means you see everything. Like, you see the entire scene, and it's not like a close up.
Right. There's one fight scene on a bus that I feel like, just because of the cramped space, there are some tighter angles and cuts, but for the most part, you do see all the action happening. Most of the fight scenes are like that. You can see the whole thing, and it does feel like the people are actually like fighting each other, and it's not just cut. But I will admit, like, the fighting in the finale, once the actual weapons and the rings get involved, it does feel more CGI-ish and less like actual martial arts than the other parts of the movie do.
That's unfortunate.
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't set a good precedent for the future, because like Shang-Chi in the comics is like the best martial artist in the Marvel universe. So the fact that they've given these 10 superpower rings to essentially have him do CGI energy blasting stuff on top of martial arts doesn't bode super well. But
They tried it with Dragon Ball Z.
I feel like there is a Dragon Ball Easter egg in here, because there's a chunk of the movie where he's wearing an orange jacket with blue sleeves. And that's,
yeah,
I mean that could be a Naruto Easter egg too, I guess. But
but Naruto's already a reference to Dragon Ball Z, so we'll call it more likely a Dragon Ball Z reference.
So coming around to final thoughts, I think Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is probably one of the movies I've enjoyed the most since Avengers Endgame, if I'm really thinking about it. And I think that probably has a lot to do with the
movies or Marvel movies.
I'd say movies in general, to be honest.
Okay.
And that's partially because I didn't like. There's movies that I think that I've watched that are probably technically better films than this, but I had expectations for those that weren't met. Like Joker would be a good example of that, or I don't know. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but just I think because I wasn't expecting
Space Jam.
Space Jam.
I don't know if you were expecting anything, but
I was expecting. Well, I got more or less what I expected. But yeah, I think because I wasn't really expecting much, my expectations were exceeded, and so my impression of it is greater. And it certainly gets me excited about where the MCU is going. Which, not to throw Black Widow under the bus, because she's certainly done that enough to herself, and Marvel's done that to her, and Disney's done that to her. But that movie didn't get me excited for the future of the MCU in the same way that Shang-Chi has. It feels like they're still got some gas in the tank in terms of doing things that are new, and it doesn't feel like more of the same. And I'm excited to see where they go from here. So I'll give Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings 3.4 out of 4 bad cookies.
Okay. Well, having not seen it yet, I'm going to, from the trailers and from your review, I'm going to give it a between 3 and 3.5 out of 4 bad cookie. Situation pending. Maybe we'll come back. Maybe I'll come back in a little moment in our next episode and be like, oh, by the way, 3.2 or 6.8 or no, I don't mean like randomly. We'll be talking about something. I'll be like, oh yeah, 3.2, eh? Okay, cool, and move on. I mean, in a specific segment.
So Shang Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings is out in theaters. It's only available in theaters for 45 days. So if you want to see the movie and you feel comfortable going to movie theaters, by all means, go and see it. I think it's good use of your time and money.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
So this is when we would go inside the Bat Jar and pull out a topic for next time, but we did pull George of the Jungle out of the Bat Jar a few weeks ago.
Yes.
And it's been trumped by Paw Patrol and now Shang Chi. So I think next week it's time to give George his justice. So our next episode will be about George of the Jungle, focusing mostly on the Disney movie from the 90s, but we'll obviously make reference to his origins as well. And
excellent. The one with John Cleese, right?
yes, the one with John Cleese as the voice of the ape.
Yes.
There you go.
Good movie.
Yeah.
I'll enjoy talking about it.
No one dies in this movie. They just get really bad boo-boos. Oh, it's going to be fun. All right. Well, until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
Catch you on the flip side.
Oh!